Well, welcome everyone to episode number 88. We're getting there to almost three figures now. This is an episode featuring Dr. Trent D. Stevens on the topic of science and the Old Testament. Dr. Stevens has a recent book out on the very same topic. It's actually the image for the podcast episode. It's a very good book. I read the electronic edition a few weeks ago. And because we will be studying the Old Testament next year, and of course the first few lessons deals with, say, Moses 1, Abraham, the creation accounts, and Genesis, and so forth, I thought it would be apropos not just discuss the creation, if you will, but Old Testament and science issues, which will inevitably come up. And just on that, definitely check out my friend Ben Spackman's doctoral dissertation on Joseph Fielding Smith and the creation debate as well. Well, that comes to mind. So, Dr. Stevens or Trent, thank you for coming on. I really do appreciate it. And because this is the first time you're appearing on the podcast, how about you give an introduction to your good self? Like, have you always been a Latter-day Saint? What's your educational background? And also, what got you interested in delving into not just science, but also science and scripture and theology? And can you tell us some things about the various books you've authored or co-authored?
Yeah, so I grew up in southern Idaho. Have been a member of the church since I was baptized at the age of 8 years old. Never had a time when I doubted the church or left the church. My foray into evolution and religion really began when I was only 11 years old. There was a series of editorial, I think 5 editorial pieces in Life magazine in 1959, with the last one culminating in November of 1959 with a statement that pretty much everyone accepted the theory of evolution as being established fact. And so I wrote a letter to the editor. And I said that not everyone accepts the theory of evolution. I, for one, do not. And I pointed out that I was working on a theory called the chromosome barrier to evolution. And when I was 16, a few years later, in high school, I obtained a copy of a book called Chromosome Numbers and Animals. It had been published in late 1950s and then republished in the early 1960s. And it was basically just a table. It didn't have much text to it. It was just a book of tables of listing of animals and their chromosome numbers. And so I took that book and I plotted the evolutionary hierarchy, or the hierarchy of animals on the y-axis and the number of chromosomes on the x-axis. And I proposed that if one organism had led to another, then the more complicated and higher level an organism were, the more chromosomes it should have. And therefore, you should see a linear curve of an increase in chromosome number with an increase in complexity. And what the data in the tables that I looked at and plotted showed was that there's actually no linearity. It's just a random walk up and down, and the number of chromosomes don't correlate with with complexity, as at least as I understood it. And so then I I graduated from high school in a little tiny town of Malta, Idaho, in south central Idaho, and then went to BYU. And my freshman year there, I decided that in the spring of my freshman year, which is 1967, for my English class where we had to write a thesis, I would write my thesis on a chromosome barrier to evolution and disprove evolution and become famous in the process. I also had the goal of being the first person to map a chromosome. And I first of all, discovered very early on, my freshman year, that T.H. Morgan and his fellow his students had already mapped the Drosophila chromosome, the fruit fly chromosome, starting in 1924. So I was a few years too late to be the first person to map a chromosome. So that went out the window. My idea of disproving evolution, in writing my thesis, I came across a paper by Hampton Carson at the University of Hawaii, looking at Drosophila species in Hawaii and the evolution of these species, and the fact that when you compare one species to another, what you see is that there is a distinct pattern in what's called the polytene banding pattern of these chromosomes in Drosophila that very strongly supported the evolution of these Drosophila. In the process of writing that paper, I did a 180-degree turn, and became convinced that evolution was actually a very important biological principle, and that it was correct. So I had to totally change, revamp my thinking about evolution. That chromosomes actually are very strong supportive. Chromosome patterns are very strong support of evolution. So then I continued on. I went on a mission for 2 years, came back as a sophomore, went into microbiology. I started out as a chemistry major, but I switched into microbiology and zoology because I was interested in molecular biology. The term hadn't even been invented yet. I took a molecular biology course as an undergraduate using Jim Watson's first edition of the Molecular Biology of the Gene. So I was really on the bottom floor when it came to molecular biology. I went into developmental biology and also found that the embryonic development is very strong, provides very strong support to the theory of evolution. Never lost my faith, never stepped away from the church, never doubted my belief in the church through all of this. And so beginning back then, when I was still an undergraduate, I decided that I needed to find a pathway, at least for myself, where my theology and my biology could be compatible. I didn't pigeonhole them. I didn't put them into two separate categories to study religion on Sunday and science the rest of the week. I've always been inclined to find common ground between the two. And then so I did my PhD at the University of Pennsylvania with Dr. James Leish, working on the biochemistry of the lateral plate in chick embryos just before the limb buds appear. So I've been interested my whole entire career in morphology and understanding how genes regulate morphology and how that morphology appears in the embryo and what mechanisms cause it. A parallel study of mine that also, which led me to go to the University of Pennsylvania in the first place and work with Dr. Leish, was the mechanism of action of the drug thalidomide, which causes severe limb defects. So limb normal development and limb abnormal development has been my push my entire career as a model to understand morphogenesis. I then went to the University of Pennsylvania. After the University of Pennsylvania, graduated there in 1977. I went to the University of Washington, did a 4-year postdoc in pediatrics under Dr. Thomas Shepard, one of the world's leading experts in birth defects. And then in 1981, took a position at Idaho State University, teaching dental students in what's called the Idaho Dental Education Program. And I've been teaching ever since. I still continue to teach 3 courses, even though I retired in 2011. I have nonetheless continued to teach. I teach anatomy. My PhD is in anatomy. I teach anatomy and histology and biochemistry to the first year dental students each year. And I continue to do research. About 1995, somewhere around in there, an undergraduate, a non-traditional undergraduate student in theater, came to the department chairman of biology and was complaining that evolution was being taught as a fact. And the department chairman sent him to me. He was LDS, and so the department chairman thought that would be a good person to talk to. So after I spent about an hour or so talking to him, he asked me if there was any books written on evolution and the church. And I told him that there wasn't really anything recent. And so he said, well, why don't you write such a book? And out of that collaboration with him and also with Dr. Jeff Meldrum in the Department of Biology, the 3 of us wrote a book called Evolution and Mormonism, A Quest for Understanding, which came out in 2001. And I've been writing ever since. I have about 10 books that I've published on theology and science. The most recent ones I've written in about the last 5 years. I've written a book called The Infinite Creation, a book called The Infinite Fall. Elder Tad Collister had written a book called The Infinite Atonement. And Bruce R. McConkie, in a speech at BYU in 1981, said that the only way we can understand the atonement is to understand the fall and the creation. And so I wrote the infinite creation and the infinite fall to go along with Elder Collister's book, The Infinite Atonement, to make that trilogy. I then wrote a book called The Immortal Messiah. I've written a book entitled Who is Adam? All of these are addressing, and then I've been doing a blog each year for the Come Follow Me lessons. I started out with the Old Testament, wrote Science in the Old Testament, and then I have 3 more books that will follow up on that in each of the next successive years. Science in the New Testament, Science in the Book of Mormon, Science in the Doctrine and Covenants. Those are upcoming books. I'm also in the process of writing several other books on the relationship between science and religion. I'm just finishing a book called Noah's Flood and the Precepts, the Philosophies of Men. Noah's Flood and the Philosophies of Men, which it's under review right now, and I'm planning on getting it published by the end of the year. So that's kind of a long version of who I am.
Well, really, really appreciate it. And I look forward to the forthcoming books. They should be very interesting. So perhaps we should start off, say, some of the common misconceptions Latter-day Saints and others within, say, the broad Judeo-Christmas perspective have when it comes to the Old Testament and other issues. And that's the issue that the Old Testament may be considered a science textbook. So some of the issues about, say, the so-called conflict between science and the Bible, science and scripture, usually comes down to, say, presuppositions, or to use the fancy term we have in theology, one's hermeneutic or the interpretive lens they have. So how do you approach scripture? Do you think it should be read as strictly a science textbook, or do you believe that there's different presuppositions going into one's approach to these issues?
Well, actually, both. I believe the Old Testament to be the Word of God, as far as it's translated correctly. And I have a sort of a broad definition of that translated correctly, and in fact, including the prophets who received the revelation concerning the Old Testament, that that revelation was given through the filter of their minds, which had held contemporary beliefs and certain paradigms of their time. So they saw, in my opinion, they saw what was happening in the what's now recorded in the Old Testament, and in the case of Moses, the revelations that he received in terms of the creation through the lens of his own paradigms of the time. And so when I look at the Old Testament or any scripture, I'm very interested by creationists, by theologians, particularly creationists, who claim to take the Bible literally and then don't. My point is, if you're going to take the Bible literally, let's take it apart and let's dissect it and let's ask the question: what do the scriptures really tell us about the story? For example, there's this notion that partaking of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil caused mortality to come into the entire world, everything in the world. And particularly, and then as Orson Pratt originally proposed, that the fruit caused blood to come into Adam and Eve's veins and they became mortal. That is not what the scriptures say whatsoever. For example, if you look at the book of Genesis, in chapter 3, after Adam and Eve partook of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil in verses 22 to 24, the statement is made by God that by partaking of that fruit, Adam has become as one of us, knowing good from evil, lest he partake of the fruit of the tree of life and continue to live forever. Let's put cherubim and a flaming sword in the east of the Garden of Eden to keep Adam and Eve from getting back to the tree of life. Well, that tells us an enormous amount about the tree of life. The tree of life was capable of giving Adam and Eve immortality as long as they had access to it. So if blood entered their veins after they partook of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, then that whole idea that they could go back and eat of the tree of life and continue to be immortal is made null and void. So the problem that I see is that people who put their own interpretation on the scriptures, like in this case, do it in complete contradiction to what the scriptures actually say. So I'm willing to debate anybody based on scripture. I mean, I'm a scientist, and I'll debate based on science as well. But most scientists who debate creationists don't have that foundation in the scripture, which I have. I've read the scriptures extensively and pondered and searched and studied them extensively. So I like the idea of let's debate the scriptures on the basis of scripture.
Well, thanks for that. I'm glad you kind of mentioned the whole blood issue, because that was actually one of the things I was hoping to ask, because you actually do have a discussion in your Old Testament book about how that may be like a common misconception that seeped into the LDS interpretive lens with Orson Pratt. So, and it's very popular, but thanks for that. So, one of your main areas of research and expertise, of course, is the issue of macroevolution. So, but many, like Latter-day Saints and others, object saying macroevolution is inherently godless. It's a purely naturalistic thing. There's no room for God in it. And that's one end. And when it comes to, say, Latter-day Saints, there's the whole debate, like, well, does that mean you can't believe in the historical Adam? Because, of course, for Christ to atone for the sins of the world, there has to be, like, say, the fall, one of the three pillars of eternity from the Bruce McConkie talk that you referenced earlier. So how do you, as a believing Latter-day Saint, square, if you will, the evidence for macroevolution, like, say, fused chromosomes and other issues as well, that kind of can't really be explained away except for, like, say, macroevolution happened in some way with the belief in an intelligent creator, as well as, like, say, the necessities us LDS must believe in. Like, say, there was a historical Adam, there was a historical fall. It wasn't clear, it wasn't merely a teaching device, it's not merely symbolic. And all those other issues, like, say, the first presidency statements about the origin of man. I know that's a big question, so take as long as you want on that, but there's a lot of the presuppositions that will inform a lot of the debates about Genesis and origins for Latter-day Saints especially.
Well, okay, so first of all, looking at macroevolution, I'm not a paleontologist and I'm not a geologist. I'm a developmental biologist, geneticist, biochemist, anatomist. And what I see in terms of macroevolution is what's going on in the embryo. I have taught head and neck anatomy for much of my career to dental students. And in order to teach head and neck anatomy, I also taught oral histology and embryology to the same students. So to understand what's going on in the development of the face, your ears, your jaws, etc., we have to understand what's going on in the embryo. And the embryo, human embryos, have branchial arches. The word branchial means gill. So do we have gills as embryos? No, we have gill arches, which don't become gills in us because the cleft between the gill arches don't break completely through like they do in fishes. But the arch looks exactly like it does in almost every vertebrate, looks the same. And so in order to understand how our face develops, we have to understand how the face develops in the context of an embryo. And it parallels the development of the face in every other vertebrate embryo. And we even have genes that are involved even in invertebrate embryos developing. So in terms of macroevolution, I find, again, what I know from chromosome patterning and what I understand from embryonic development as being incredibly strong supporters of macroevolution. Now, in terms of the position of Adam in this whole story, I've really focused on that in two of my books, The Infinite Fall and the book Who is Adam? So if we go back, and so we, as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, have a unique theology in terms of understanding the fall. Most Christians seem to have this idea that the fall of Adam and Eve some way took God by surprise, that he put them into this garden and they were supposed to be immortal forever, and we're supposed to be connected to God. We, that is, all of humanity. The problem that most the Christians have is the question, well, while Adam and Eve were immortal in the Garden of Eden, did they have children? No, they only had children after they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. So there is no we in the Garden of Eden. There is no fallen humans in relation to the Garden of Eden. It was only Adam and Eve who fell. So the fallen humanity is a very strong misconception when you look at LDS theology from the perspective of LDS theology. So let's go back to the pre-existence, which again, the rest of the Christian world doesn't seem to even recognize that there was a premortal existence, that some way we magically come into existence at the time of our birth and we don't have a premortal life. We believe that we are eternal beings, that we were intelligences and were born as spirit children of God. Then there was before the foundation of the world, there was a council in heaven. And Christ stepped forward to champion God's plan. It wasn't Christ's plan, it was God's plan. And Christ stepped forward and offered to be the the atoning one for all of our sins and for the fall of Adam and Eve. So if you have an atonement, you have to have an atonement for something. And the big thing was we have both the physical fall and the spiritual fall. And the spiritual fall is our problem. And the physical fall was from Adam and Eve. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. In order for us to have accepted the atonement, the 2/3 of us who accepted Christ's plan, we needed to understand what the atonement was atoning for. So one of the things that's kind of interesting that I find, and I don't know why it's not mentioned in the scriptures, is that in order to understand the atonement, we had to understand the fall. And so therefore, in that pre-earth council, we had to be taught about the fall of Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve, then one assumes, had to have stepped forward and taken on that role just as Christ took on his role for the atonement. And we, because we had free agency, could not be forced out of God's presence. We were allowed to leave his presence so that we could come to earth and learn and then go back to his presence. And so the fall of Adam and Eve were the mechanism by which we could leave God's presence on our own volition without God forcing us to leave. Now, if we go to Christ's atonement was retroactive as well as proactive. So his atonement, Christ atoned for everyone who had ever been born before him, as well as everyone who would be born after him. In the same vein, an infinite fall would cover everyone born before Adam and Eve, as well as everyone after Adam and Eve. In order for it to be infinite and eternal, it had to cover the whole entire spectrum. So therefore, the idea that there were people who lived and died for thousands or even millions of years in the human line before Adam and Eve came along is, in my opinion, completely consistent with this premortal council in heaven and this notion that we accepted Adam and Eve as our representatives in the fall. So that's kind of in a nutshell where I view our theology as not being incompatible with the very long history of humankind. In fact, another book I'm working on right now is called The End of Evolution, and it deals in part with the idea that the difference between us and chimpanzees is only about 1.5% of our genome. And every hominin that spans that gap between us and chimpanzee, whether you're talking about Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Australopithecus, all of that whole entire hominin line has to fall within that 1.5%. And therefore, we're probably not, even if you look at Homo, it's probably not a genus, it's probably a species. For example, we're Homo sapiens sapiens, now that we understand our past history with interbreeding with Neanderthal, whereas Neanderthal is Homo sapien neanderthalensis. So we're looking at subspecies here, not separate species. So that's where my science and theology put me at the present time.
Cool. And related to that would be how would that square like evolution and stuff like that? Is that how you would square, like, say, the Latter-day Saint belief about us being created in the image and likeness of God, where it's not only a moral image, but you would say it's still compatible with having this kind of three-dimensional physical image as well?
So we're created in the image of God as an ideal. All of us fall short of that As I said, one of my areas of expertise is birth defects, particularly the drug thalidomide. So there are were and still are people being born today, and particularly caused by thalidomide previously, who are born with no arms and no legs. So how is that person in the image of God? So the image of God, in my opinion, is the ideal. I teach my students when I teach anatomy that no one is perfect. Everyone has birth defects. We just most birth defects we never see until we get into the laboratory and start dissecting the human body, dissecting cadavers, and we to find a person that doesn't have a birth defect internally is an extreme rarity. Almost all cadavers that we dissect have various birth defects. So that being in the image of God is an ideal. And if we look at, for example, any hominin we want to identify, they're in the same image. We have an upright stance. We have 5 fingers, 5 toes, arms and legs. We have the same number of vertebrae in our cervical region, in our neck, in our thorax, in our lumbar region. So all of that puts us in a common morphological pattern.
No, that's really informative. I do appreciate it because I've had some. I'm not going to name names, but they're in BYU, Idaho as well. Two Latter-day Saints who seem to hold a Yunar creationism that say, well, macroevolution can't really explain us being in the image of likeness of God and so forth, and they can bring up like say deformities and stuff like that, or the fossil record saying like, well, you can't be consistently LDS and hold that view, but if you think it's an ideal, that kind of helps a great deal as well. Try to harmonize our theology, which is rather embodied and anthropomorphic, with the scientific data as well. So I do appreciate that. There's some other issues as well. Of course, like many Latter-day Saints, and I'm sure you'll be addressing this in your book on Science and the Doctrine and Covenants, particularly section 77, but many Latter-day Saints, not just based on that text, but like say the plain reading of Genesis and other narratives, seem to think that the Earth is young, not necessarily like say 6 or 7,000 years, but only a couple thousand years old. As what are the problems with both like a young Earth, in your view, but also like say the problems with the idea that there was a global flood? I know some people bring up the heat problem, but from your areas of expertise, what do you think are like some of the insurmountable problems with holding to like a literal global flood? Not necessarily a flood, of course, but a global flood, as well as like a young Earth.
So as I mentioned before, I'm just finishing a book called Noah's Flood and the Philosophies of Men. So if you look at young Earth creationists, the book that most of those people today now point to as being sort of the source of their theology is a book by Henry Morris and
Whitcomb, I think his name as well.
Yeah, the Genesis flood, and the problem there is that first of all, they point out at the very beginning of their book, and it is the theme that's pointed out in places like Answers in Genesis, which was created and run by Ken Ham today, that the Bible is completely infallible. And then in a debate with Bill Nye about 10 years ago, Ken Ham stated several times that the Genesis flood was global, was universal. Well, those words don't appear in the Bible. Neither one of them appears in the Bible ever, especially in relation to Noah, the flood of Noah. The earth being flooded, the Hebrew word there, it can either be translated as earth, small e, or land. Uh, there's another Hebrew word that means the earth with capital E, meaning what we perceive of as our planet now. But at the time these words were being used in Hebrew, they didn't have any concept of our us being our Earth being a planet. There was a much more limited view of what the Earth actually was and what it looked like. And I take this up. There's several chapters that I address this issue in my upcoming book. But if you look at the issue of a flood that Noah experienced, the first chapter of the book, what I've done is taken what we read from Genesis and described it as a what if story. So let's say that Noah and his family were living beside a river, and they were several hundred miles away from the ocean. At Noah's time, most people never traveled much more than 100 miles away from the place of their nativity or where they grew up. In this case, if we look at LDS theology, we can talk about Noah and his family living somewhere in roughly in the state of Missouri, on the American continent. So he's warned by God to build an ark to save his family. And so he builds an ark. You have this enormous rainstorm. It rains for 40 days and 40 nights. The river swells to 15 cubits above flood level, which is about 22 feet. Noah and his family and all their animals are loaded into the ark. They get swept down into the Missouri River, into the Mississippi River, out into the Gulf of Mexico. You only have to be about 12 miles away from land, and the entire earth appears to be covered with water. So if Noah had never experienced being on the ocean before, he's now flushed out into the ocean by this enormous flood. Similar floods happen all the time. Just last July 4th, there was a flood like this in Texas, where the floodwaters rose 26 feet in 45 minutes. And that's roughly the same amount of water that the Bible describes as washing Noah away from his home and all the people that drowned around him. So he's out in the ocean, and he's in the ocean for a little over a year. As far as he can tell, the water has covered everything. The highest mountain is covered with water, as far as his perception is. And then at the end of this roughly 1 year period, he ends up coming ashore in the Middle East, where the rest of the biblical story unfolds. So he ends up going in through the Straits of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean, and there's a lot of geographical information that suggests that the flow of water can end up in a boat or any other object leaving the American coast and ending up on the European, North African coast, particularly right in the area of the Straits of Gibraltar. The predominant water flow is into the Mediterranean from the Pacific, and you end up in the Middle East where the rest of the story unfolds. So you can take that biblical story, you can take what we understand about geography, and the two are quite compatible. So the story is completely accurate as far as Noah's perspective is concerned, or Moses' perspective, who saw this apparently in vision, and then wrote about it. So from those perspectives, the story is a good story. It's a fine story. It just isn't. And what's happened is that then it's been elaborated upon generation to add this mythical, magical components that people think have to be a part of religion in order to be for us to be religious. We have to believe in mysterious, magical circumstances. So that's where we really get the young Earth notion, is that not only did we have a creation which there was a limited number of animals roughly 6,000 years ago, but then we had this huge bottleneck where the only animals on the entire Earth that survived were those that were taken into Noah's Ark. Excuse me. If you look at Moses's apparent writing of his vision in the pre-captivity era, and then you look at the Babylonian captivity, and then the Hebrew scholars, Israelite scholars coming out of that post-captivity era, whatever was written before the captivity was almost certainly lost. Because when the Babylonians sacked Jerusalem, they burned everything that was combustible. So any paper records, any records on wood or wax or anything else would have been destroyed. They then hauled off anything made of metal and melted it down. So metal plates would have been lost. Papyrus records would have been lost. And the only thing that the Hebrew scholars had was what they had memorized and took with them. And then you have them passing this down through the 70 odd years of their captivity from one generation of scholar to the next, and adding in a few little tidbits from the story of Gilgamesh from the Babylonian mythology. For example, the size of Noah's Ark, I think, is really quite interesting, because the size of the Ark is compared, well, if you look at Gilgamesh's Ark, it's like, I think it's 150 cubits or something like that, whereas Noah's Ark is 200 cubits or 300 cubits. So it's kind of like the Israelite scholars were saying, well, the Babylonians have their idea of the flood, but our God is more powerful than their God, so Noah's Ark had to be bigger than Gilgamesh's Ark. And then you have this story of the birds being released from the Ark toward the end of the flood story, and it's almost word for word out of Gilgamesh. So what I think we have is a memorized version of the flood going into the captivity, loss of all the records with the exception of the brass plates of Laban, which were taken to the Americas. And then you have this enhancement by the Babylonian influence, which is what we now have as the flood story today. And then it was further enhanced by the translators, particularly of the King James Bible, who were very conservative Calvinists. So we get their spin on the whole story too.
Really appreciate that. And this kind of goes into, like, say, something I myself have often wondered about as well. But you've kind of touched upon it, like, say, in your some of your previous books, and I'm sure you'll be discussing it in your book on Noah and the Flood and other topics as well. And that's like many Latter-day Saints, based on, like, say, some of Joseph Smith's comments, often, like, say, after he's dead, but there's quite a number of them, seem to indicate the location of the certain old world events. Well, actually, biblical events, like in the opening few chapters do not take place in the old world, but instead the new world. Like there's a common belief that say the Garden of Eden was in Missouri, that Adam Undai Ammon, the original Adam Undai Ammon is actually also in the new world in Missouri. And you kind of mention, like, say, the flood taking place in Missouri, and somehow Noah was translated or transposed to the old world context, and so on and so forth. So how solid do you think is the evidence for this, based on, like, say, first of all, the data from, like, say, uniquely LDS revelation and tradition and so forth? And two, how do you square that with, like, say, the science and other data as well?
Well, there's really a paucity of data here. If you look at Missouri as being the site of the earliest portions of the biblical story, for example, we have the story of Adam and Cain and Abel, and the story of sacrifice, and building an altar when he was kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and offering sacrifice. So if the setting is in the New World, what did he sacrifice? We talk about agriculture. We talk about flocks in the Old Testament. Clearly, if you look at at anthropology, that coincides very nicely with the idea that Adam and Eve lived about 6,000 years ago, some 4,000 BC, with it being an agricultural story, because the transition from agriculture, or from the hunter-gatherer societies to an agricultural society, occurred somewhere around 10 to 12,000 years ago. So if Adam and Eve were a hunter-gatherer story, the way that we get the story of Cain and Abel, for example, wouldn't mesh. But at the same time, in my opinion, one of the problems with understanding this at face value, and I've wrestled with this in some of my writings, some of which haven't yet been published, will be coming along, is this idea that, what did they sacrifice? And what flocks are we talking about? Because North American animals, there were no sheep, as we understand it, as far as we know, in like domestic sheep, for example, in a place like Missouri. So there's still some questions that need to be some way resolved, or maybe not. Maybe they'll never be resolved. But there are certainly outstanding questions, and by no means does the model that I presented offer all the answers. It only offers part of the story.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. And in your view, though, just maybe like to go back on the flood and its New World location, you would believe, though, like it was a local flood, but somehow through, like, say, maybe streams and stuff like that, it can be explained away, like they still somehow was translated or transposed to the old world. And I'm sure you'll be discussing that in your forthcoming Noah book, will you?
Yes.
Oh no, that's perfect. Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, yeah, because like it doesn't really keep me up at night, but some of these like New World events in an it's on my shelf. So like I do appreciate, like, say, some of your work on this already and some of your previous work. So I look forward to like delving more into it. So that's greatly appreciated. Let's see. Now, you, of course, like, you've written a book specifically on science in the Old Testament, and you have like some interesting approaches to topics. And when I say interesting, like informed, not like, say, out there. But one that comes to mind is like you discuss like Jonah, and he's been swallowed by a great fish, as the Hebrew says. Now, one thing I actually liked about that chapter is like you kind of go through and kind of show, like, say, some of the stories or apologetics to try to defend the historicity of that. It's like to be blunt, bogus, like the guy who was swallowed. So do you want to say like the problems with like say the common apologetic you often hear even amongst Latter-day Saints, like, well, Jonah being swallowed by a fish, that's been scientifically proven to be true because of that sailor who survived a similar incident. I've actually heard that a couple of times in gospel doctrine classes. So if you want to, like, unfortunately pop that balloon.
Well, so first of all, there's a time issue here. So in the New Testament, um, supposedly Christ made the statement that Noah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Now, and this would be a sign of Christ's death and resurrection. But Christ was crucified on Friday afternoon/evening, and as part of the reason for the Roman soldiers to kind of hurry the death of these three people who were crucified was that night was falling, and at sunset the Sabbath would begin. So we're pretty sure that this was very late on Friday, and then he was resurrected on Sunday morning before sunrise. So it was still dark on Sunday morning, and so we have 3 days. We have Friday night, we have Saturday, we have Sunday morning, but we don't have 3 nights. We only have 2 nights. And so it may be something that's kind of been added in the New Testament, this idea that it was not only 3 days, but also 3 nights. And if we calculate, which I've done in my book, The Immortal Messiah, I calculate how long Christ was actually in the tomb was roughly 36 hours. So if you then go back and look at stories of people who have been swallowed by whales and then ended up being cut open, or the whale being cut open and the person coming out alive, was within that range, certainly a matter of hours, although some of the stories may be somewhat apocryphal. In terms of these whaling stories, whether they can be completely trusted or not is certainly an open question in my mind. Did I lose our
Uh,
connection?
oh no, sorry, I just had to pop up really quickly. But no,
Okay.
that's good. Sorry about that. Another topic you also, because like Christmas, I can't believe the years flying by so fast. Christmas will be in a few weeks' time. So, and you do have a chapter on the a discussion about the Star of Bethlehem. So, do you believe like this? There was a literal star? Do you believe it was like some type of supernatural phenomena, or do you believe it may have been some other phenomena that was guided by God? So, what's your take, if you will, on the star of in Matthew 2?
Well, first of all, according to the Book of Mormon account, it was probably all of the above. Um, and it appears that whatever happened was most observable in the Americas compared to in the Old World. So in the Old World, if you look at the story, if we were to eliminate Matthew chapter 2 from the New Testament, we wouldn't have a star at all. In fact, one of the things that's quite interesting is that the Old Testament prophecies don't even talk about a star at the time of Christ's birth. Nonetheless, you have these magi coming from the east somewhere that said, "We've seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." So apparently there was some um, belief among certain um, astronomers, astrologers, wise men that studied the heavens, that there would be some kind of that a king would be born in Israel, and that there would be a new star to herald his birth. Now, what's interesting about this star is that if you actually read Matthew chapter 2 and read it very carefully and take it literally, they then traveled to Jerusalem over some period of time. Uh, Herod killed everyone, all the children under the age of 2, so it may have taken them as much as 2 years to get to Jerusalem. They asked the question, where is the new king born? And they say, because we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. And Herod then asked, when did you see this star? So obviously, the star wasn't in the sky at that time, because otherwise the wise men would have said, well, come out and look at it yourself. So that star was sometime in the past. And then he consulted his wise men about where Christ would be born, or where this king would be born, and they told him it would be in Bethlehem. So he sent the wise men then. And then we have this very curious statement that the star guided them to the house where Christ was, which is really kind of hard to believe. I think you're looking at a little bit of apocryphal writing there in terms of a star actually guiding them to a specific location, which may suggest that it was a comet or something along those lines. But if you look at what happened in the New World, where the celestial events were multiple and were so profound that there was a day and a night, and a day where there was no darkness at night, which we don't see described in the account of Matthew. It may have happened, but probably not in Jerusalem, probably not in Bethlehem, because it was not something that even Herod's wise men had taken much account of. So I think, and a lot of people have speculated as to what the star might have been. Maybe it was a nova, and maybe it was the conjunction of certain constellations. May have been all of the above over an extended period of time, as seen in the Americas.
Thank you for that. Now, in your book, and everyone should get a copy of the book, whether Kindle or print, there's a lot of chapters in it. So this is tip of the iceberg. But one topic in my studies I've done a lot of work on is like the origin and development, like say Satanology and demonology. So I've done a lot of work in say Jude 9, which is a very unusual text. And for those who don't have the scriptures open, it's a passage. Yet Michael the archangel, when contending with the devil, he disputed about the body of Moses, durst not bring against him a written accusation, but said, the Lord rebuke thee. Now, for those who want my approach to the text, look at my blog. But you actually had a really interesting chapter on this particular issue about the body of Moses, Deuteronomy 34, Jude 9. So could you give us like a synopsis of your own take, if you will, on this interesting, often misunderstood passage and event, if you will?
Yeah, so in the process of my writing, particularly in writing my book, Who is Adam, I took on this question of, we believe in our theology that Adam is Michael. And so then I asked the question, well, how many times is Michael mentioned in the Bible? And I think, as I recall, the number is 5. Very few times he's actually mentioned by name. 3 of those are in the book of Daniel in chapters 9 and 10, which are really, really, to me, extremely fascinating chapters, because Daniel has been praying for 3 weeks, 21 days, that God would soften the heart of the Persian king and let the Israelites go away from the captivity, the Persian captivity, and be able to build their temple. And at the end of 21 days, Gabriel comes to him and says, well, I left heaven, if you will, when you first started praying 3 weeks ago. But the devils were so the powerful around the Persian king that I couldn't get rid of them on my own. So I had to go get Michael and have him come and help me. And I think that's an incredibly fascinating story, because here's Gabriel, an angel who doesn't have enough power to get rid of these satanic forces, and he's recruits Michael the archangel, which archangel means the first angel, to help him get rid of these evil spirits. And then, so those are the three mentions in the Old Testament. And then we come to the New Testament. There's only twice that Michael's mentioned. One in the book of Revelation, which is the famous one of the war in heaven, where Satan is cast out and Michael is in charge of the forces of God, forces of good. And then the other one is in this weird verse in Jude. Now, if you look at what biblical scholars have said about Jude, apparently the first century Christian scholar Origen claimed that Jude got his information from an apocryphal, what's now an apocryphal book called The Ascension of Moses. And I think that statement is really quite fascinating, because the ascension of Moses would mean that he had gone up. And we don't have that. The ascension of Moses has since been lost. We don't have that story. But if you look at Moses chapter 1, which is actually a prelude to the Old Testament, Genesis 1:1 corresponds more with Moses 2:1. So you have this whole entire chapter of Moses, which is a prelude, where Moses ascends to a high mountain. So Moses chapter 1 could actually be subtitled The Ascension of Moses. So then what happens is Moses has this wonderful vision, and then the spirit leaves and he's left kind of, he's totally wasted physically. And then Satan comes along and tries to get Moses to worship him. And Moses says, well, where's your glory? And Satan becomes very angry and starts beating on the earth and ranting and raving. And then Moses prays for help, and he is strengthened. Now, we're never told in Moses chapter 1 how he was strengthened. But if you look at Gethsemane, for example, Christ was supported by an angel. Which angel? If we were going to place bets, I would put my bet on Michael. That Michael was strengthening Christ in the Garden of Eden. Who better to be giving him strength? And also, then, what better angel, the most powerful angel in heaven, numero uno, to come and strengthen Moses to support him against Satan? So now, if you take that context, if you take that what-if story from Moses chapter 1 and you apply it to Jude, there is this struggle between Satan and Michael over Moses. It fits perfectly with what we get, the story we get in Moses 1:1. The only thing or Moses chapter 1, the only thing that's missing is the name of the angel, or the statement that the angel strengthened Moses and the name of that angel. And I think, my personal belief is that was Michael. That's how you get the story in the book of Jude.
Cool. Really, thanks for that. And a bit of an aside, but I know, of course, like, you've written an entire book on Adam, and I used to work for the B.H. Roberts Foundation, and one of the projects I did was not just like Adam God sources, but like, say, Adam, Michael, Ancient of Days sources. So it was good to see like a fellow doctor saying delve into that particular topic. If you have a take on this, feel free to share it. If not, just say pass and kind of move on to, like, say, the remaining 2 or 3 questions. But just because it has like contemporary currency at the moment, of course, course, like in our theology, Adam is like, we have a very high view of Adam. We think he's the Archangel Michael, the Ancient of Days in Daniel 7. Do you have any particular approach or take, if you will, on Brigham Young's so-called Adam God teachings, or is that something you've not delved into yourself?
Yeah, sure. So, um, first of all, President Kimball stated very specifically that we do not believe in the Adam God theory, even though some people still seem to kind of cling to that even today. Um, so, I've had experience over the 44 years that I've been teaching anatomy and other topics here at Idaho State University that I have a lot of my students are members of our church, and they, I, in introducing myself, I talk about serving a mission, I talk about graduating from BYU, etc. So they have this impression that I'm an active member of the church, but I also teach from the perspective of biology and the perspective of evolution unapologetically. And so I've had many students come to me and ask me, how do I reconcile the two? And so I actually go to this very topic of Adam being, quote, transplanted from some other world, or Adam and, quote, one of his wives being Eve, who were resurrected beings, came here, were transplanted to the earth, all of those kinds of Adam God sort of statements. So then I ask a simple question to these students, which covers, I think, all of these topics, and that is, were Adam and Eve inherently immortal? I love to ask questions that actually are laying a trap for my students to get their attention. Most of my students reply in the affirmative. And when they reply such, I then ask the question, if Adam and Eve were inherently immortal, what was the function of the tree of life in the Garden of Eden? Clearly, both in Genesis and in Alma, in the Book of Mormon, we're told that after partaking of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they could have put forth their hand and partaken of the tree of life and still live forever. So, according to those scriptures, the purpose of the tree of life was to keep them immortal. Well, why would they have a tree to make them immortal if they were already immortal? So the scriptures then, to me, indicate very clearly that Adam and Eve were mortal beings placed in a temporary immortal state in the Garden of Eden because they had access to the tree of life. So partaking of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil did absolutely nothing. If you read, you can read word for word in the scriptures exactly what happened. The tree of life got them kicked out of the Garden of Eden and separated from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, got them kicked out of the Garden of Eden and separated from the tree of life, which was their source of immortality. So all of that story, again, if you read the scriptures and you read the scriptures literally, and you read what the scriptures say, and you don't try to read something else into the scriptures are saying that Adam and Eve were not inherently immortal. They weren't God. They weren't a resurrected Adam transplanted from some other world to this world. They were physical beings that, according to the teachings of recent prophets, everyone who has ever been born was born of parents the same way, specifically referring to Christ, but also that extension would go to Adam and Eve. And I have a whole chapter on my book about Adam. Did Adam have an umbilicus? Did he have a navel? And that whole weird and interesting history of that story. I think all of the evidence, and I'm talking about evidence from the scriptures themselves, would completely contradict the idea that Adam and Eve were in some way immortal beings transplanted to the earth to start the human race here.
Thank you for that. So One of the topics you've discussed in the past, and I think this is the first time I actually heard about you, and this is like years ago now, is that you co-authored a book with Meldrum, who is passed, on DNA and the Book of Mormon. So, in the years that have followed since then, um, ha, you know, has there been any developments with respect to genetics in the Book of Mormon, DNA studies in the Book of Mormon? Of course, my friend Ugo Priego has done a lot of good work on this, and I'm sure you're familiar with at least some of it. So, um, has there been any developments? And also, how would you respond to, like, say, well-meaning but errant members who would use like the X haplogroup to this day as evidence of some type of support for the Book of Mormon, particularly the Heartland geography? And just for like, so just so you know, I don't hold to the Heartland model. I actually hold to like a limited Mesoamerican model, but some well-meaning LDS still kind of harp on the X haplogroup, particularly for that geographical area. So, any thoughts on those topics?
Well, I likewise with you. I find this ex haplogroup and the Midlands model to be quite fascinating, but not necessarily convincing to me. Um, so um, I've discussed this in my book, well, my forthcoming book, which is in my blog. You can actually uh, pull up my blogs, trentdstevens.com, and you can read my blog dealing with this particular question. Uh, and in my year-long series of blogs on science and the Book of Mormon. Um, so when the reason that Jeff Meldrum and I got involved in writing this book, Who Are the Children of Lehi, came as a result of a panel discussion we were involved in. After we wrote the book Evolution and Mormonism, we kind of got on the radar of people who were uh, dealing with topics on the church and science, and we were invited to be on a panel discussion at a Sunstone symposium to discuss this issue of the DNA data and the Native Americans. And the point we made in that panel discussion, and the point that then carried over into our book, Who Are the Children of Lehi, is that if you look at a family, if you look at Lehi's family being, well, let's say somewhere maximum range of 50 people being transplanted from the old world into onto the American continent somewhere, and you already had a population of probably several millions of people already living in the Americas by 600 BC. That the insertion of 50, 60 people would not have any appreciable impact on the genetic makeup of the population in general. Number one, and number two, the Book of Mormon's story is constantly a story of the Nephites being attacked by the so-called Lamanites. You have, I think it's in Jacob, where the numbers are discussed, where the Mulekites are much more numerous than the Nephites, and the Lamanites outnumber them both combined. So then the question is, where did all the Lamanites come from? It's sort of like it's like the Israelites referring to everybody else as Gentiles. I think the word Lamanites in many cases is being used in the same context. Anybody that's not us, anybody that's not quote Nephites. And then you ultimately 400 AD have the complete destruction of the Nephites, a very specific focused genocide, and so after Christ came, the words Nephites and Lamanites didn't have the same ethnic or genetic meanings that they did before. They simply were the believers versus the non-believers. But if you look at at gene markers that were around in say 400 AD, and a very tiny percentage of the population then. It's it would be remarkably surprising if there were any genetic markers identifiable today from that tiny of a insignificant size of population from the Book of Mormon. So that's my position is that the scientific data, all the data that we have looked at, well, I shouldn't say all the data, the vast majority of data indicate that the origin of the Native Americans was Siberia, across the Bering Land Bridge. However, there are additional data from various sources which suggest that you have a tiny sprinkling of genetic markers from other places in the world. And you have some ethnic and some artifactual evidence for other migrations coming to the Americas. There was a statement made in a program that was aired about 20 years ago, I think, about the colonization of the Americas, or the discovery of the Americas. And the statement at the end of that program said, "We used to ask who was here before Columbus. Now, with all the data, with all the evidence that's accumulating, the question more appropriately would be, who wasn't here before Columbus? Everybody was here before Columbus, from all over the world. And so even though we have the bulk of the people, probably from looking at the genetic data, coming from Siberia and other parts of Asia, it's almost certain that you had other small migrations from a whole bunch of other places in the world, including Europe and China and other sites. So a very tiny population from the Middle East, in my opinion, genetically would be just swamped out and not be seen."
Thank you for that. And just like one final question, because I know we're going to ask the hour mark, would be, how should we understand miracles? Like, many people think miracles are like God doing the impossible, but there's also a strand of thought in LDS thought that miracles are like super, basically God interacting with nature, but like doing something amazing, but not against the laws of logic, if that makes sense. You know, they're a higher form of the laws of order and nature and so forth. So how do you understand, like, say, the concept of miracles itself as someone who's trained in science? And maybe, like, if you were to, like, how that is reflective in one of the biblical miracles that you discuss in your book.
So if we look at miracles historically, for thousands of years, humans have observed the stars and have noticed that there are most of the stars are what are referred to as fixed stars. But then there are these other stars that wander around the sky, and thus were given the name planets, these wandering stars. And originally, the movement of these stars was thought to be magical, that they were pushed around to heaven by each one being assigned to a specific angel that moved it around heaven. And we have since, after the Copernican revolution, recognized that these planets are solid or gaseous bodies like the Earth, and orbit the sun in specific orbits. So we have a lot of scientific information now that has answered a question that could only be answered by miracles before. If one looked at some of the stars now that are movable in the sky, we have a whole bunch of little twinkling stars that move rather quickly across the sky. I remember as a Boy Scout going out and lying in a camp out looking at the sky and watching a satellite actually move across the sky. So, so if that would have happened back during the Old Testament or New Testament times, that would have been a miracle. We now recognize that these are put into orbit because once you gain a high enough speed and the right speed, you can put an object into orbit around the Earth, and you know now the Earth is being orbited by thousands, if not millions, of pieces of junk that we've put into space over the years, including great big huge things like the space station, etc. So all of that would have been miracles before, and are recognized. We were able to understand them fairly easily now. Now, I have spent a lot of time thinking about and doing a lot of research on matter in the universe, specifically dark matter and dark energy as they relate to what we call normal matter. And I've written quite a bit about this in several of my books. So roughly about 4.6% of what we can identify or what we recognize as matter and energy in the universe is what we call normal matter, whereas 95.4% is either dark matter or dark energy, of which we know almost nothing. So the only thing we know about dark matter is that it has gravity. We don't know anything more about it than that. It's apparently responsible for the shape of the actually even existence of galaxies, stars being clustered into galaxies and not being pulled apart. Requires dark matter associated with those galaxies, and the shape of the galaxies also require dark matter. So 75% of the matter in the universe is dark matter. Joseph Smith said in the 131st section of the Doctrine and Covenants, verses 7 and 8, he said, "There's no such thing as immaterial matter. All spirit is matter, but it's more highly refined, and we can't perceive it with our natural eye." That's a perfect definition of dark matter to me. So I'm writing a book. One of the books I'm working on right now is called The Periodic Table of Dark Matter. The idea that dark matter may not be a thing. It may actually be, there may be dark carbon, there may be dark oxygen, there may be dark hydrogen, that we have a a parallel universe to normal matter in a shape form of dark matter. And it's there's 3 times as much of it as there is regular matter right around us. So all we have to do is reach out. If we knew how, if we had the knowledge, like for example, we have gained the knowledge of how to launch a satellite into orbit. If we had the knowledge of how to maneuver dark matter, we could actually go to a wedding and take these jars that were empty and have everybody leave the room. Christ was the only person in the room, and actually then pull the matter from around him to produce wine in these jars. Likewise, with the miracle of feeding the 5,000, you start out with a very scant amount of fish and bread, and using that as a catalyst, if you will, sequestered other matter to the point where everyone was fed to their satisfaction, and there was more extra pieces gathered up than what there was in the original bread to begin with. So I think that, in my opinion, what has been stated, if we look at the Bible dictionary, it talks about miracles as being things that we don't currently understand, can't currently describe by our current scientific knowledge. And I think, this is my personal opinion, that if we get to the point where we can understand and even manipulate dark matter, we could actually make bread and fishes ourselves. I don't know that we're ever going to get to that point scientifically, and certainly not in my lifetime. But I think that we've already put stars into space with our knowledge. I think we can actually perform other miracles if we understand the mechanisms.
So basically, like replicators from Star Trek.
Well, excuse me, what was that?
Oh no! When you said like we could actually be able to like create like loaves and fishes ourselves, immediately comes to I'm a fan of Star Trek, so like the
Oh,
replicators from
Star
Next
Trek. Oh,
Generation.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. I'm a big Trekkie myself. Yeah.
I knew there was a reason I liked you, but yeah, no, that's
So,
perfect.
so Star Trek was actually one of my freshman courses. I began my career at BYU in the fall of 1966, and the first Star Trek episode aired in September of 1966. So in my dorm of, I don't know what we had, like 350 students in my dorm at Chipman Hall and Heritage and Helaman Halls. We had one television, and it was down in the basement in the laundry room. And so I think it was Wednesday night, that place was packed with students watching Star Trek, and so I consider that as one of my freshman courses because Star Trek began the year I started my college career. I loved Star Trek.
Yeah, we only had like two TV channels growing up here in Ireland. So like when I was like very like say 4 or 5, I started watching Next Generation reruns.
Yeah, I only had one channel growing up in southern Idaho, so you had double the number I had available to me.
Yeah, but no, I love the Next Generation, love the original series movies. So yeah, bit of an aside, but yeah,
Live long and prosper.
indeed. But I love the fact that came from Hebrew as well, so that's brilliant. But we're actually at the close. But if someone wanted to like contact you, what would be the best way? You mentioned the blog. Want to give the link to that and any other details before we end this episode today?
So my email is stevenstrent7 at gmail.com. And I would love to talk to people. One of my goals in writing the books that I have written and am currently writing is my target group is high school juniors and seniors and college students, even graduate students. I've had students that I've taught in dental school tell me years later that because of the way I teach my courses and I'm not at all hesitant to bring in theology and my science teaching, that has been a very positive influence in their lives of them remaining active in the church. I find that for me, thinking about things like making the loaves and miraculously making loaves and fishes and how that might relate to dark matter is a stimulus to pursue the deepest realms of science, to reach out and write a book like the periodic table of dark matter is my motivation for doing that. It's a book of science, but it's motivated by my religion, by my theology, and so I really love to speak to especially students about these issues. I hope starting this spring, I hope to be launching a major campaign to reach out to college students and talk to them about some of these issues and convincing them that everybody ought to be a combination of an astrophysicist, an anatomist, and biochemist. I think the word for that is an alchemist. Um, so we need more of those.
Well, Dr. Stevens, thank you for coming on and taking time out of your schedule to discuss this. And I look forward to your forthcoming books, particularly the Noah one. That should be an interesting read. So, again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. I appreciate your invitation.
And enjoy the rest of your day and your weekend.